Hi, my name's Eric Rodriguez, and here I'll be presenting the critical assignment CAP 1 in KIN 516. So in this first slide is the key steps of each of these pathways. So I'll be explaining to you the two pathways. So in the first pathway is the glycolysis, citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. And then the second pathway is the fat breakdown, so the beta oxidation, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Okay, so now as you can see in the graph, so I'm going to describe what this graph is detailing. So in the first pathway, in glycolysis, glucose is activated, which then leads to 6 carbon glucose molecules split into two 3 carbon molecules called pyruvate. Small amount of ATP is generated in the process, and then the high energy electrons are transferred to a molecule called NADH. Now, as it gets through that in glycolysis, that leads to the citric acid cycle, or known as the Krebs cycle. Pyruvate conversion enters into the cycle, which then leads to CO2 being released. Then more NADH and FADH2 are produced, and then small amount of ATP is generated. Then that lastly leads into the electron transport chain. In the electron transport chain, electrons from NADH and FADH2 pass along a series of proton complexes, then leads to a proton pumping, creating concentration gradient. Lastly, that's where the ATP synthesis is where large amounts of ATP is produced. So that's pretty much the home of where all the ATP is produced and throughout both pathways. And then now that's the first pathway. Now the next one I'm going to be talking about is the fat breakdown. So the beta oxidation, Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle, and then electron transport chain. So in the beta oxidation, palmitoyl CoA is broken down into 2 carbon acetyl-CoA units through series of reactions, producing NADH and FADH2 in each cycle. Then that leads to the citric acid cycle, where the acetyl-CoA molecules enter the cycle, producing NADH, FADH2, and GTP. And then lastly, in the electron transport chain, the NADH and the FADH2 generate proton gradient, producing more ATP. Okay, so now next is the total ATP yield for each pathway. So as you can see, glycolysis, citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, and then electron transport chain. So in the glycolysis, this is the first stage of cellular respiration. So this is where 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule is being produced. And then once that converts, and then that enters into the citric acid cycle, and that's where it generates more ATP along with the carriers like NADH and FADH2 to help produce obviously more ATP. And then in the electron transport chain, that's pretty much the home. So what it does is, as more ATP is being produced in glycolysis and citric acid cycle from the NADH and the FADH2, that then adds up all the molecules from those 2 cycles and then comes into the home where the electron transport chain is, and that's where 30 to 32 ATP molecules potentially are produced from the reactions happening from the NADH and then the FADH2. So how the pathways interact across exercise intensity and duration. So there are 3 different intensities and durations that impact the pathways. So the first one is obviously the high intensity activities. So pretty much, for instance, like doing a lot of sprinting, cutting, a lot of fast twitch movements. This is where the phosphagen system is primarily used to provide immediate energy. So pretty much, if you think about it, more energy is being used as you're using the quick twitch movements, with a small contribution from glycolysis. So as you can see, more ATP is being generated along with the phosphagen system that is primarily used to provide immediate energy. So obviously with the more ATP being produced and obviously with the phosphagen system being used, people are more effectively able to do these high intensity activities like sprinting, cutting, running, doing even lifting heavier weights or doing more HIIT workouts more efficiently in that sense. Next one is the moderate intensity and moderate duration. So in this one, as the exercise intensity decreases and duration increases, so pretty much when there's like, say you're doing a workout and you're incorporating more rest, but obviously longer workouts, but incorporating more rest in between each set, this is where the glycolytic pathway becomes more dominant. So pretty much you're not entirely, relaxing a bit. Yes, you are taking breaks in between sets, but this is where the glycolytic pathway, where the sources of energy of ATP is being used. So you're able to have energy while you're taking your break and not feeling exhausted. And then with that being said, there's a gradual increase in the contribution from oxidative phosphorylation. And then lastly is low intensity, low duration. So pretty much this is very, very light exercise. So jogging, swimming, walking, even doing chores around the house, or even doing like working outside, doing small activities. This is where the oxidative system is the primary source of ATP, utilizing a mix of carbohydrates and fats as fuels. So pretty much all the proteins and all the foods that you're eating, even during this low activity and low intensity, really plays a big role in regards to how your body is going to be reacting during this type of exercise. So obviously during this stage of intensity and duration, the proper amounts of food and nutrition is very vital in regards to how much energy you're going to be having throughout that time as well. So the primary factors that limit ATP production in each pathway. So the first one I'm going to be talking about is NADH, is the limiting factor for the steps of glycolysis. Obviously, when it's available, with that being said, glycolysis isn't able to produce enough ATP, which means that with the lack of energy, it either slows or shuts down because it doesn't have the amount of power and intensity to be able to produce it without ATP. So technically, that would make it non-efficient, and glycolysis would eventually not be in existence. And then lastly, since the electron transport chain is dependent on O2, which is the final step for ATP generation, so obviously in the electron transport chain, that is pretty much the home of where the ATP is generated and stored. So obviously with that being said, with it being stored, it's going to need to be dependent on O2. And now if there's no O2, or if there's like very little O2, it will limit the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle activity, ultimately shutting down the production of the ATP, causing the cycle to not be complete and not produce the amount of ATP molecules that it should be, which would be around 32 ATP molecules. So normally if there's lack of ATP happening in the citric acid cycle, it would be producing less, which wouldn't ultimately be reaching the ATP total, which is normally around 30 to 32 ATP molecules. So the synopsis of these pathways. So the first one is glycolysis. So this is the simplest and fastest pathway occurring in the cytoplasm. Obviously, it breaks down glucose into pyruvate. You generate a small amount of ATP, so 2 molecules per glucose molecule with no oxygen required. And then this pathway is crucial for, like I was saying before, quick bursts of energy. So like sprinting, cutting, doing HIIT exercises where your heart's pumping and where the body is really moving. And then the next one is the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. So this pathway takes place in the mitochondria where ATP energy is and requires oxygen. So it further oxidizes pyruvate derived from glycolysis and produces CO2, water, and a significant amount of NADH, which is a high energy electron carrier. And then from that, the NADH is then used in the electron transport chain, so that's where the home of the ATP molecules are, and that's approximately 30 to 32 glucose molecules. And then lastly is the oxidative phosphorylation. This is the most efficient pathway for ATP production and also occurs in the mitochondria. So this pathway is essential for sustained energy needs during activities like running or endurance exercising. So if you're looking to get more cardio and obviously get more endurance, so like longer distance runs or other activities that doesn't require doing as much like lifting or quick burst, oxidative phosphorylation is the most efficient pathway for that. And then here lastly is my references, and I am all done.